I don't know what to do anymore.
Imagine the one person you've always relied on, the one person who promised to never let you down, suddenly starts treating you like a stranger. It's a betrayal that cuts deeper than anything physical, and the pain lingers long after the words are spoken. For years, Jonathan was the rock of his family. He worked tirelessly to provide, to love, to give everything he had to his son, Chris. But one day, Chris began to change. The calls went unanswered. The visits became few and far between. What once was a bond built on love and trust now felt more like an obligation than a relationship. Jonathan found himself questioning everything. How had things gone so wrong? Was his son really the man he thought he was? Or had all those years of sacrifice been in vain? The silence grew louder, and the feeling of being invisible became unbearable. Jonathan had given everything for Chris, but now he was nothing more than a distant memory. The realization hit hard. No amount of love or support could fill the void Chris had created. And so, Jonathan made a decision that would change everything. He walked away. No warning, no explanation. He sold his house, packed his bags, and disappeared to a small cabin in the mountains. For 6 months, he cut all ties. It wasn't a punishment, it was a lesson. And when Chris finally came searching for him, desperate to fix what he'd broken, what he found would be nothing short of shocking. The man he thought was broken had become stronger than ever. This hook sets up the emotional intensity and curiosity needed to draw viewers into the story, building suspense and mystery around Jonathan's disappearance and Chris's eventual realization. Jonathan had always been the kind of man who believed in the value of hard work, sacrifice, and the unwavering bond of family. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or extravagant displays of affection. Instead, his love for his son, Chris, was shown through quiet acts of devotion, working long hours, making sure there was always food on the table, and never once complaining about the sacrifices he made. From the moment Chris was born, Jonathan's world shifted. It wasn't just about himself anymore. It was about giving his son everything he never had. Jonathan's childhood had been far from easy. Raised in a small town by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, Jonathan knew the struggles of life all too well. The days of cold winters with no heat, nights spent studying by candlelight, and the pressure of always having to be good enough were not lost on him. It was these challenges that shaped him into the man he became, determined, resilient, and fiercely protective of those he loved. When he met his wife, Linda, and together they had Chris, Jonathan made a silent vow to give his son a better life than the one he had. He worked hard to build a stable life, one where his family never had to worry about the things he once had. His dream was simple: to provide Chris with the opportunities he never had, to show him a life of stability, love, and security. As Chris grew, Jonathan's role as a father became his greatest source of pride. He taught Chris how to ride a bike, how to fix things around the house, and how to be a man of integrity. There was no greater joy for Jonathan than seeing his son smile, knowing that the sacrifices he made were worth it. Yet, as time passed, something began to shift. The once tight-knit bond between father and son started to unravel, slowly but surely. It wasn't an overnight change. It was gradual, like a slow erosion that could hardly be noticed until it was too late. At first, it was small things. Chris started spending more time with his friends and less time at home. His once open and affectionate nature began to be replaced with a cool distance. Jonathan tried to brush it off at first. He told himself that it was just a phase, that his son was growing up and becoming independent, as all children eventually do. But as months turned into years, the distance between them only grew. Chris became more preoccupied with his own life, his own ambitions, and his own world. Jonathan, who had always been there for him, found himself left behind. The hardest part for Jonathan was that Chris didn't even seem to notice. Calls went unanswered, visits were avoided, and whenever Jonathan did try to engage with his son, he was met with excuses or indifference. It was as though the bond they once shared had faded into the background of Chris's life, replaced by something or someone else. Jonathan couldn't help but wonder what he had done wrong. Was he too overbearing? Had he failed as a father in some way? But even as these thoughts plagued him, the silence from Chris remained. It wasn't just the neglect that hurt. It was the feeling of being invisible. Jonathan had always prided himself on being there for his son, but now it felt like he was nothing more than a shadow in Chris's life. It wasn't a dramatic rejection, but rather a subtle, gradual one. Chris no longer needed him in the way he once had. And for Jonathan, that realization was a gut punch. The love he had poured into his son, the time he had spent building a life for them both, seemed to have lost its meaning. But Jonathan wasn't the kind of man to sit idly by and wallow in self-pity. He had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, and this was no different. Instead of confronting Chris or seeking validation from him, Jonathan decided to take a step back, a bold step that would ultimately change everything. It wasn't an angry decision. It was a decision born out of heartbreak and a need for self-respect. Jonathan packed up his things, sold his house, and left everything behind. He moved to a small, quiet cabin tucked away in the mountains, far from the life he had built. It wasn't about punishing Chris. It was about showing him what life could be like without him. For 6 months, Jonathan lived in complete isolation. He spent his days in solitude, working on simple tasks, woodworking, reading, and reflecting. The cabin was modest, with only the essentials, but it was enough. In that quiet place, Jonathan rediscovered something he had lost: peace. The decision to cut ties with his son wasn't easy. Jonathan's heart ached every day, missing the sound of Chris's voice, the laughter they used to share. But he knew that sometimes love meant giving someone the space to grow, even if it meant stepping away completely. He had always believed that love should be unconditional, but now he understood that respect had to be earned. And until Chris realized the value of their relationship, Jonathan had to find his own sense of worth without relying on his son's approval. As the days turned into weeks, Jonathan's life in the mountains became a journey of self-discovery. He was no longer the father trying to please his son. He was Jonathan, a man who had to find his own strength. And in doing so, he began to realize that he didn't need Chris's approval to feel valued. He was enough, just as he was. As the days passed in the small, quiet cabin, Jonathan began to settle into a rhythm of solitude. Life in the mountains was simple. There were no distractions, no phone calls, no appointments to keep. It was just him, the wilderness, and the space to reflect. At first, the quietness was jarring. He had spent his entire life surrounded by noise: his work, his family, the constant hum of daily life. The silence in the cabin, however, gave him room to think, to process the overwhelming hurt that had slowly built up in his heart over the last few years. But no matter how peaceful it was, the isolation didn't ease the pain of being abandoned by his son. Jonathan missed Chris more than he cared to admit, even though he had made the difficult decision to leave. What hurt most wasn't just the distance, physical and emotional. It was the way Chris seemed to drift further and further away from him with each passing year. What had happened to the boy he once knew, the son who would sit with him for hours, talking about his dreams and asking for advice? Where had that closeness gone? Jonathan's mind wandered back to those earlier days, the days when Chris was a child, full of life and wonder. He had been so proud of him. He remembered teaching him how to ride a bike, how to fish by the lake, and how to face challenges head-on. The bond they had shared felt unbreakable. But now, it seemed that their connection had been slowly eroded by the demands of time and Chris's growing independence. It wasn't as if Chris had ever voiced any dissatisfaction. There had been no major argument, no blowout fight that left them on opposite sides. Instead, the change had come slowly, like a tide creeping in, pulling their relationship farther from the shore. It wasn't until Jonathan had realized that his son was no longer interested in spending time with him that the true weight of the situation hit. Chris had stopped reaching out, stopped looking for guidance, and eventually stopped even trying to hide his indifference. Jonathan was left in a painful limbo, unsure of whether Chris simply didn't care or if something deeper was at play. Had he failed as a father? Had he been too much of a presence in his son's life, stifling him in some way? The questions plagued Jonathan constantly. He tried to convince himself that Chris was just going through a phase, that all children grow up and find their own path. But there was an underlying ache, a feeling that something had gone wrong. Chris's behavior was an unspoken rejection, a quiet message that Jonathan had become irrelevant, that the sacrifices he had made meant nothing in the eyes of his son. He couldn't shake the feeling that, in some way, he had been replaced. When Jonathan made the decision to leave, he thought it would be temporary, a way to clear his mind and allow Chris the space he seemed to need. But the more time passed, the more Jonathan realized that his son's indifference wasn't just a phase, it was the new reality. Chris had moved on. He had built a life without his father, without the need for Jonathan's guidance or presence. And Jonathan, despite his decision to leave, couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of loss. The realization settled in slowly, painfully. Chris no longer wanted him in his life. It wasn't a sudden rejection. It was a gradual fading, like a photo left out in the sun, slowly losing its color and clarity. This realization was the turning point for Jonathan. It wasn't just the pain of being ignored. It was the understanding that Chris had stopped valuing him entirely. The thought that his own son, the person he had poured his love into, no longer needed him cut deeper than anything else. In a way, it felt like a betrayal, not just of their relationship, but of the years Jonathan had spent making sacrifices, giving everything for a future that Chris now seemed to want no part of. It was at this point that Jonathan began to question the very nature of his relationship with Chris. What had he done wrong? Was he too protective? Had he somehow stifled Chris's independence, his ability to grow on his own? Or had Chris simply grown up and found his own way, leaving his father behind in the process? The pain of these questions was constant, but Jonathan knew that he had to face it. There could be no more pretending that everything was fine, no more hoping that things would magically improve. It was clear that something had to change. This conflict, of being left behind by the person he had loved most, became Jonathan's reality. And as he sat alone in the cabin, he realized that the person who needed to change wasn't just Chris, it was him. He had to stop being the father who was constantly seeking validation from his son. He had to learn how to find his worth without needing his son's approval, how to rebuild his own identity without relying on the relationship that had defined him for so long. The pain was overwhelming, but it was also a necessary step in the process of healing. Chris, for all his faults, had unknowingly pushed Jonathan to this point of self-reflection. But now, Jonathan knew that he had to do something more than just wait for things to get better. He had to act. The only question left was, what would he do when Chris finally came looking for him? Jonathan spent the days at the cabin wrestling with his emotions, a battle he couldn't escape. Every morning, he would sit by the window, staring out over the dense woods and the distant mountains. The silence of the wilderness was both comforting and suffocating. For the first time in years, he wasn't busy fixing things or managing life's responsibilities. He was simply existing in the quiet. But that very stillness left him with his thoughts, and those thoughts were unsettling. The pain of losing his connection with Chris hadn't dissipated in the solitude of the mountains. It had only deepened. What had once been a low hum of sadness now felt like a constant ache in his chest. He would spend hours reflecting on their past, the moments they had shared, the laughter they once enjoyed, and the times when Chris had looked up to him with admiration and trust. That was the boy Jonathan had raised, the son who saw his father as a hero. But now, that hero was invisible in Chris's eyes. What hurt the most wasn't just the physical distance. It was the emotional abandonment. Jonathan tried to push away the nagging thought that Chris's rejection was final, but it was becoming harder to ignore. There were no phone calls, no messages, not even an attempt at reaching out. Chris had slipped out of Jonathan's life as quietly as he had slipped into adulthood, and Jonathan had no idea how to reclaim what they had lost. Despite the pain, Jonathan kept telling himself that this was necessary. He needed this time to heal, to rebuild himself without the crutch of his son's validation. But as the days turned to weeks and then to months, that sense of necessity began to fade, replaced by a new emotion, fear. Fear that Chris was gone from his life for good. Fear that, despite everything he had done for his son, the love they had shared had simply run its course. The thought gnawed at Jonathan constantly. He had always prided himself on being there for Chris, never wavering, always showing up. But now, there was nothing he could do to change the situation. Jonathan tried to reach out a few times, but each attempt was met with silence. He had sent a few letters, brief messages meant to check in, to say that he was thinking about Chris, that he still cared. But those letters were returned unopened. That rejection stung more than the years of indifference that had come before it. To him, it was confirmation of everything he had feared. Chris no longer needed him. There was no space left in his life for a father who had failed to keep up with his changing world. The emotional toll of the silence weighed on Jonathan. Every evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon, he would find himself pacing the small cabin, lost in thought. He had come to the mountains for peace, for clarity, but all he found was uncertainty. The quiet that had once been a balm for his soul now felt like a constant reminder of the emptiness between him and his son. He couldn't help but ask himself, had he done enough for Chris? Had he been the father he needed to be? Or had his efforts been wasted, overshadowed by a growing disconnect he couldn't even see happening? As the months wore on, the sting of his son's absence only became sharper. Jonathan had been living alone for so long that the pain of rejection began to feel like an old wound, one that had been torn open again and again. But the silence wasn't just about Chris. It was about Jonathan, too. His sense of self-worth, once tied to being a father and protector, was now fractured. Without Chris, who was he? What purpose did he serve? In the absence of his son's love and approval, Jonathan was forced to confront a painful truth. He had based his entire identity on his role as a father, and now that identity was unraveling. And yet, despite the pain, Jonathan couldn't bring himself to reach out again. He had made a choice, one that he believed would be the catalyst for change, not just for Chris, but for himself. But now, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Jonathan began to feel the weight of his own decision. Was this the right thing to do? Was he pushing Chris away for good? Or was he giving him the space he needed to grow, to see the consequences of his actions? The more Jonathan thought about it, the more conflicted he became. He had hoped that time apart would make Chris realize what he had lost. But as each day passed, Jonathan began to wonder if that would ever happen. What if Chris didn't care anymore? What if the man Jonathan had raised, the boy he had loved with all his heart, had changed so much that there was no room for him in Chris's life? It wasn't just about the rejection anymore. It was about the possibility of never being a part of Chris's life again. The thought of that was unbearable. He had always imagined that, no matter what, Chris would come to him, that they would rebuild their relationship. But now, Jonathan wasn't so sure. As the weeks passed, he found himself consumed with anxiety. The man who had once been so sure of everything now felt like a stranger to himself. What was the point of all this sacrifice if, in the end, it meant nothing? How much longer could he endure the silence? And more importantly, what would happen when Chris finally did reach out? Would it be too late? Would Jonathan even have the strength to forgive him? The conflict inside Jonathan was no longer just about the hurt he felt from Chris's rejection. It was about the loss of himself in the process. The very foundation of who he was had been shaken. And with each passing day, the stakes grew higher. Jonathan's life at the cabin had become a delicate balance between introspection and growing despair. Each day, he woke up to the same quiet surroundings, the smell of pine in the air, the creaking of the wooden floor beneath his feet, and the distant rush of a stream flowing just beyond the trees. The isolation that had once been soothing now felt suffocating. The loneliness crept into his bones, a weight that seemed impossible to shake. But it wasn't just the solitude that gnawed at him. It was the ever-present question of Chris. Would his son ever come looking for him? Would he ever realize what he had lost? Or was Jonathan now nothing more than a memory in Chris's life? The emotional stakes were rising higher with every passing day. Jonathan had hoped that his absence would force Chris to confront the space between them, that the pain of losing his father would spark some kind of change. But as the weeks turned into months, the truth began to set in. Chris wasn't coming. There were no letters, no phone calls, no signs of remorse, or even curiosity about where Jonathan had gone. It felt as though Chris had completely moved on, leaving behind the father who had given everything for him. The weight of that realization crushed Jonathan's spirit. Jonathan had always believed in the power of family. He had devoted his entire life to building a future for Chris, to making sure his son had everything he needed to succeed. He had been a father, a protector, and a provider. But now, sitting alone in the cabin, he couldn't help but wonder if it had all been in vain. What was the point of all his sacrifices if, in the end, it didn't matter to Chris? What did it mean to be a father if the bond between them could be so easily broken? He had raised Chris with love, giving him every opportunity he never had, hoping that his son would appreciate the sacrifices he made. But now, it seemed as though Chris didn't even care. It was a pain unlike anything Jonathan had ever experienced. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the sense of betrayal. For so long, he had believed that Chris was his purpose, the reason he worked so hard, the reason he made all those sacrifices. But now that Chris had turned away from him, Jonathan felt like he was adrift, lost in a world that didn't have room for him. The emotional toll began to show in small ways. Jonathan's sleep became restless. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, haunted by the image of Chris, now a stranger to him. In his dreams, he saw his son, but it was always a dream of the past, a time when they were close, when they still shared that unspoken understanding. In these dreams, Chris would look at him with eyes full of admiration and love, but when Jonathan reached out to touch him, Chris would vanish, slipping away just beyond his reach. Every night, the dream felt like a cruel reminder of the bond that had been broken, a constant cycle of hope and despair. And yet, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a chance. Even as the silence from Chris grew louder, Jonathan's heart held on to a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Chris was going through something he couldn't understand. Maybe he was struggling in ways Jonathan couldn't see. He had to remind himself that no relationship was ever perfect and that there was still time for healing. But as each day passed without a word from his son, that hope began to wither. The uncertainty of the situation began to consume him. The weight of his decisions, the consequences of walking away from Chris, began to feel unbearable. Had he made a mistake? Had he pushed his son too far? Was this the end of everything they had once shared? Jonathan's self-doubt intensified. He questioned everything: his parenting, his decisions, his worth. He had always taken pride in being the kind of father who never gave up, who never walked away. But now, in the solitude of the cabin, he couldn't help but wonder if he had failed Chris, if he had been too harsh, too distant in his own way. It wasn't just the absence of Chris that hurt. It was the sense that maybe he had been wrong all along, that maybe this was his fault. Had he misjudged the situation? Was this the price of trying to teach his son a lesson in respect and love? Despite his growing despair, Jonathan knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't undo the decision he had made to leave. It wasn't about pride or stubbornness. It was about the lesson he needed to teach Chris. He had to stand firm in his choice, even if it meant enduring the pain of being absent from his son's life. He couldn't keep chasing after Chris, hoping he would come back. Jonathan had to let go, had to trust that, in time, Chris would realize the importance of their relationship. But that trust was slowly eroding. The emotional toll was becoming too much. Jonathan had lived his entire life for his son, and now that bond seemed to be slipping away like sand through his fingers. As the days blurred into weeks, the ache of abandonment threatened to consume him entirely. And yet, through it all, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder, was he really the one who had abandoned Chris, or had Chris abandoned him first? Was he wrong to walk away, or was he simply standing up for himself, for the love and respect he deserved as a father? The line between self-respect and rejection had become blurred, and Jonathan could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The emotional stakes had never been higher. With each passing day, the possibility of losing his son forever grew more real, and Jonathan was left wondering if there was any hope left for their relationship. The days were beginning to blur together. Jonathan had been living in the cabin for what felt like an eternity, surrounded by nothing but the echoes of his own thoughts. The solitude that had once seemed like a refuge had now become his greatest torment. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the walls, reminded him that he was alone, and that his son, the one person he had always tried to protect, had become a stranger to him. It wasn't that Jonathan didn't understand the passage of time. It was just that, after so many years of being the constant in Chris's life, he had no idea what to do with the space that had suddenly opened up between them. The pain was constant, but it was the silence, the absence of any kind of communication from Chris, that gnawed at Jonathan the most. The messages he had sent had been unanswered, the letters returned unopened, the phone calls ignored. With each rejection, Jonathan's sense of self-worth took another hit. It wasn't just the abandonment. It was the fact that he had given so much, and yet none of it seemed to matter. Was it really this easy for Chris to forget about him? Then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountain peaks and the forest fell into a deep quiet, the phone rang. Jonathan had been sitting by the window, staring into the distance, when a sudden sound jolted him from his thoughts. It was the first time in months that the phone had actually rung. His heart raced, an unexpected mix of dread and hope swelling in his chest. Could it be Chris? Had he finally realized what had happened? Had he finally come looking for him? With trembling hands, Jonathan picked up the phone, his pulse pounding in his ears. For a moment, the line was silent. Then, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Dad, it's me, Chris." Jonathan's heart stopped for a moment. The sound of his son's voice was both a comfort and a shock. He hadn't heard it in so long, hadn't heard it with anything other than the briefest exchanges, distant and fleeting. Now it was full of something different. There was hesitation in Chris's tone, something Jonathan hadn't expected. "Chris, where have you been?" Jonathan's voice came out softer than he intended, his emotions suddenly overwhelming him. "I haven't heard from you. Why haven't you?" "I know, Dad," Chris interrupted, his voice quiet but filled with something new, guilt. "I've been thinking about you a lot. I'm sorry for how I've been. For not calling, not visiting. I didn't know what to say. I guess I just assumed you didn't need me anymore." The words hit Jonathan like a punch to the chest. He had been waiting for this moment for so long, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to respond. Chris's voice, filled with remorse, was a revelation Jonathan hadn't anticipated. In that single moment, everything that had been building up inside him, the pain, the questions, the doubts began to unravel. Chris's admission was not just an apology. It was an awakening, a realization that he had been blind to the hurt he had caused. For so long, Jonathan had been wondering what went wrong, why his son had distanced himself, why their relationship had deteriorated so completely. He had blamed himself, felt rejected, and even doubted his own worth. But now, in the rawness of this conversation, Jonathan realized something profound. Chris had never truly meant to abandon him. He had been lost, confused, and unaware of the pain his actions had caused. "I didn't understand, Dad. I didn't know how much you needed me to. I thought I was doing what was best for me, but now I see what I've done to you. I was selfish." Chris's voice cracked, and for the first time, Jonathan heard the man his son had become, vulnerable, human, and full of regret. Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. The weight of the last few months, the loneliness and the silence, lifted slightly. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, one that he had no control over, one that had come from Chris's own understanding of what he had lost. "Chris, Jonathan struggled for the right words, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been waiting for you. I've been waiting for you to realize how much you meant to me. I didn't want to leave, but I had to. I had to teach you something, son. You needed to see that love and respect aren't given freely. They're earned. And I needed to earn mine too." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Jonathan could feel the weight of the silence. Was Chris angry? Did he understand what Jonathan had been trying to do? But then Chris spoke again, his voice soft but steady. I get it now, Dad. I get it. I didn't appreciate you, and I didn't understand what you were doing. But I do now. And I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry. In that moment, Jonathan felt a shift. The years of doubt, the endless questioning began to fade away. His son was here, not physically but emotionally. Chris had finally understood the lesson Jonathan had been trying to impart. Not through anger, not through confrontation, but through distance and absence. They had both been on separate journeys, but now they were finally coming back to each other. Jonathan knew that things couldn't go back to how they were before. The past had already shaped them both. But this moment, this phone call was the turning point. It wasn't just about reconciliation. It was about understanding, about recognizing the value of each other, and about knowing that despite everything, they still had time to rebuild. For the first time in months, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The phone call with Chris had been an unexpected breakthrough, but it didn't immediately erase the years of hurt and emotional distance between them. Jonathan's heart was still heavy with everything that had passed between them, and despite Chris's apology, there were things left unsaid, wounds left unhealed. Jonathan knew the road to reconciliation would not be easy or quick. Words could be exchanged, apologies offered, but the emotional damage of the past months, the silence, the abandonment, couldn't simply be wiped away. Still, Jonathan held onto the sliver of hope that Chris's admission marked the beginning of something real, something transformative. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about understanding, growing, and taking the necessary steps to rebuild the bridge that had long been crumbling. And yet, as much as Jonathan wanted to move forward, he couldn't ignore the deep reservations that lingered in his heart. He had been hurt deeply, betrayed by the son he had given everything for. Would it be enough? Would Chris's words translate into genuine change? The next few days after the phone call were a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Jonathan's mind raced with the possibility of Chris coming to see him, of them sitting face to face and talking through everything. But that anticipation was also fraught with fear. What if Chris's apology wasn't enough? What if their bond was too far broken to fix? What if this was just another false promise that would eventually fade away like the others? Then, one afternoon, as Jonathan sat by the window, staring out at the setting sun, he heard the faint sound of a car pulling up outside. His heart skipped a beat. He rushed to the door, his pulse racing with both excitement and uncertainty. He had no idea if it was Chris. He hadn't heard from him since their phone call. But deep down, Jonathan felt a surge of emotion, a desperate hope that this was the moment he had been waiting for. When Jonathan opened the door, he was met with a sight he hadn't expected. There, standing at the threshold, was Chris, looking older, more mature, but also visibly nervous. His face was drawn, but there was an earnestness in his eyes that Jonathan hadn't seen before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, facing each other, the air thick with unspoken words. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of longing, regret, and fear. Chris was the first to speak, his voice quieter than Jonathan had ever heard it. "Dad, He stopped, his words catching in his throat. He took a deep breath, trying again. "I didn't know how to do this. I don't know where to start. I messed up so many times, and I'm not sure if you'll ever be able to forgive me." Jonathan stood there, unsure of what to say. Part of him wanted to rush in, to wrap Chris in his arms, and tell him everything was fine, that they could move on. But another part of him, the part that had been hurt so deeply, reminded him that forgiveness couldn't be rushed. It had to be earned, just like respect. Instead of speaking, Jonathan motioned for Chris to come inside. As he stepped into the cabin, Jonathan felt the weight of everything hanging between them. This was the moment that would determine whether they could ever move past the hurt, the betrayal, the silence. It was the moment when words would either heal or further tear them apart. They sat down at the small wooden table, the same one Jonathan had used for years, the same table where they had shared so many meals together. But today it felt different. The space between them was more than physical. It was emotional, a distance that had to be crossed. Chris sat down first, his eyes avoiding Jonathan's. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was almost unbearable, yet it felt necessary. It was the silence of two people facing the consequences of their actions, of the time that had been lost. Finally, it was Jonathan who broke the silence. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready to say, Chris," Jonathan began, his voice quiet but firm. "I know you've been struggling. I know it's been hard for you. It's been hard for me too." Chris looked up, his eyes filled with emotion. "I don't know how to fix it, Dad. I don't know how to make it right. I don't even know if I can. But I want to try. I know I've hurt you, and I can't take that back. I don't want to lose you. Not for good." The rawness in Chris's voice stirred something deep within Jonathan. He could hear the vulnerability, the pain, the regret. It wasn't the same person who had distanced himself without a second thought. This was someone who had grown, who had realized the gravity of what had happened. But was it enough? Jonathan leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "You don't lose me just because you make mistakes, Chris. We all make them. What matters is whether you learn from them. What matters is whether you're willing to do the hard work to fix what's broken." Chris nodded, his eyes welling up with tears. "I don't want to keep running away from this, Dad. I know I've taken you for granted. I thought I could just do it all on my own, but now I see how much I need you. I see how much I've needed you all along." For a moment, Jonathan felt the walls around his heart begin to crack. He had wanted this for so long. The apology, the realization, the acknowledgement of the pain. But even in the rawness of this moment, he knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The road to rebuilding their relationship would be long, and it would take time, patience, and effort from both of them. But as Chris sat there, offering his sincere words, Jonathan realized that they had reached the turning point. This was where their journey of healing began. Jonathan sat quietly, watching Chris as the words he had longed to hear finally seemed to sink in. The apology was raw, heartfelt, and vulnerable. But as much as Jonathan wanted to believe it, the pain of the past still lingered, casting a shadow over the reunion. He had spent months wrestling with the silence. And now, even though Chris was sitting in front of him, admitting the mistakes he had made, Jonathan couldn't deny that the damage had been done. The years of emotional distance, of being ignored, had left scars. Despite this, Jonathan knew that healing could not be achieved through silence, nor by shutting Chris out. There was no way forward unless they both acknowledged the brokenness of their relationship, understood what had been lost, and committed to rebuilding it together. The conversation wasn't going to be easy, and it wouldn't be resolved in one meeting. But it was a start, a fragile and necessary beginning. Chris's voice broke Jonathan's thoughts. "I've spent so long thinking I didn't need anyone," Chris said, his voice shaky. "I thought I could handle everything on my own, that I didn't need your help, your advice. But I was wrong, Dad. I see that now. You were always there for me. You were the one person who never let me down. And I wasn't there for you." The words were simple, but they held so much weight. Jonathan's chest tightened, and a lump formed in his throat. As much as he wanted to stay distant, to protect himself from further hurt, he knew that Chris was finally being honest. The facade had crumbled, and in its place was a son who had come to terms with the emotional wreckage he had left behind. This wasn't just an apology. It was an awakening, a recognition of his own failings. Jonathan took a deep breath, pushing aside his own pride and lingering anger. He had to respond, but the words didn't come easily. Part of him wanted to shout, to tell Chris how much he had hurt him. But as he looked at his son, he saw not the boy who had distanced himself, but the man who was ready to change, to make amends. "I'm not perfect, Chris," Jonathan began slowly, his voice rough with emotion. "I made mistakes too. Maybe I was too focused on being the perfect father, on giving you everything I didn't have, that I missed what you really needed. I thought that if I just kept pushing, kept sacrificing, you would appreciate it. But that's not how relationships work. We both have to give, and we both have to understand that it's not about one person always giving everything." Chris looked down at the table, his eyes filled with regret, but he nodded in agreement. "I get that now, Dad. I wasn't seeing it. I was so caught up in my own life that I couldn't see how much you were hurting too. You gave everything for me, and I couldn't even see it until it was too late. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all the years I wasted. The apology was hard to take in, but it was the sincerity in Chris's voice that finally softened Jonathan's heart. This wasn't just an attempt to smooth things over. Chris was speaking from a place of deep self-awareness, and Jonathan realized that this was the kind of conversation they needed to have. It wasn't about laying blame or carrying resentment. It was about understanding, about acknowledging where they had both gone wrong and how they could rebuild from that place. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know if this was the start of full reconciliation, but it was a step forward, a step he hadn't believed possible just weeks ago. Still, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what this moment represented. They had both been through so much. The silence, the years of emotional abandonment, the misunderstandings, it was all still there, hovering between them. I don't know what the future holds for us, Chris, Jonathan said softly, his voice steady but uncertain. But what I do know is that it's going to take time. Trust doesn't come back overnight. I'm not going to pretend that everything is going to be okay just because you apologized. It's going to take time for both of us to heal, to rebuild what's been lost. But I'm willing to try. Chris's eyes shone with emotion, and he nodded, a single tear slipping down his cheek. I'll do whatever it takes, Dad. I'll prove it to you. I'll show you that I'm not the same person I was. I've learned so much in the past few months, and I don't want to lose you again. Jonathan reached across the table, placing a hand gently on his son's. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Chris had already shown the most important thing, the willingness to change, to take responsibility for his actions. And Jonathan, despite the pain, was willing to believe that they could rebuild something from the ruins of their relationship. You've taken the first step, Chris, Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. Now it's my turn. We can start again. Slowly, but we can start. As they sat together in the quiet cabin, the weight of the past still lingered, but so did the possibility of something new. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with moments of doubt and struggle. But for the first time in a long time, Jonathan believed that their relationship could be salvaged. The pain of the past was still there, but so was the hope for the future. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And for the first time in months, Jonathan felt a sense of peace, knowing that no matter how long it took, they would find their way back to each other. The months that followed were not without their challenges. Jonathan and Chris both knew that they were stepping into uncharted territory. The years of silence, the emotional distance, and the misunderstandings had carved deep grooves into their relationship, and the road ahead was uncertain. But something had shifted between them during that fateful meeting in the cabin. What had started with an apology had evolved into a genuine commitment from both sides to rebuild, not just a father and son's bond, but a shared understanding that, while mistakes had been made, there was still time to correct them. For Jonathan, the process of healing was slower than he had hoped. He had spent so many years building his life around the idea of being the perfect father, always there, always strong, always ready to give everything, that stepping back from that identity felt almost like a loss of self. He had to learn how to be more than just a provider and protector. He had to become someone who allowed vulnerability, who didn't just give but also received. That meant learning to trust again, not just in Chris, but in himself and his own ability to forgive. At the same time, Chris was navigating his own growth. The man he had become was vastly different from the boy who had once thought his father was just an obstacle in his life. Through the distance, the silence, and the hurt, he had come to understand just how much Jonathan had given up for him. The love and sacrifice his father had shown him, even when he couldn't see it, had finally made sense. But Chris also knew that understanding the past was only the first step. The real challenge lay in proving that he could be the kind of son his father deserved. It would take time, effort, and actions that matched his words. And so, they began again, slowly, carefully, but steadily. Jonathan and Chris started with the small things: phone calls, shared meals, moments of honest conversation. For Jonathan, every time Chris reached out, every time they sat together in the quiet cabin or talked about the past, It was a sign that their bond was not completely broken. For Chris, each act of reconciliation was a step towards showing his father that he could be trusted again. The journey wasn't easy. There were setbacks, times when old hurts resurfaced, when the emotional weight of their past threatened to pull them back into the silence that had once consumed them. But they worked through it. Jonathan realized that forgiveness wasn't a single moment. It was a process that required patience. Chris came to understand that regaining trust couldn't be rushed. It had to be earned over time through consistent effort and honesty. Over time, their relationship evolved into something new, stronger, more mature, and more rooted in mutual respect. Jonathan learned to let go of the old ways of thinking about fatherhood, embracing a more balanced, more open relationship with his son. He realized that it wasn't about always being the one who gave. It was about being present, being available, and being willing to grow alongside Chris, just as he had always hoped his son would. Chris, too, had transformed. He was no longer the young man who had distanced himself from his father in search of independence. He had learned that true strength came not from pushing others away, but from allowing himself to lean on the people who loved him. Through his relationship with Jonathan, Chris discovered the power of vulnerability, the ability to admit mistakes, ask for forgiveness, and, most importantly, forgive himself. The day Jonathan and Chris sat down together, no longer as father and son separated by time and distance, but as two people who had truly learned to understand one another, was a day of great significance. They didn't have all the answers, and their journey was far from over. But they knew one thing for sure. They had both learned the value of love, respect, and forgiveness. They had rediscovered the strength of family, and most importantly, the importance of never giving up on each other, even when it seemed like everything was falling apart. Jonathan's heart swelled with pride as he looked at his son, not as the boy who had once taken him for granted, but as a man who had learned from his mistakes. "You've come a long way, son," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you. I'm proud of both of us." Chris smiled, the weight of their past struggles still evident in his eyes, but softened by the understanding they now shared. "We've both grown, Dad. We both learned, and I'm not going anywhere this time." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a warm glow across the cabin, Jonathan and Chris sat in the silence together. Not uncomfortable, not heavy, but peaceful. It wasn't the same silence that had once defined their relationship. This was a silence filled with understanding, with the knowledge that they had made it through the hardest part. They had found their way back to each other. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more lessons to learn, more work to be done. But Jonathan knew that, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in this journey anymore. He had his son by his side, and together they would face whatever came next, with strength, with respect, and with the kind of love that had survived the test of time. In that moment, Jonathan understood the true meaning of family. Not the idealized version he had once envisioned, but the real, imperfect, but deeply valuable connection between two people who had learned to forgive, to grow, and to rebuild what had been broken. And as he looked at Chris, he realized that, despite everything, they were going to be okay. Have you ever experienced a moment where you thought a relationship was beyond repair? A time when the pain seemed insurmountable, and you wondered if the distance between you and someone you loved was too much to overcome? If so, you're not alone. We all go through struggles with the people we care about, whether it's family, friends, or anyone who has been an important part of our lives. But the truth is, healing is possible if both sides are willing to put in the effort to understand and to rebuild. What's your story? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between giving up or fighting for what you love? I'd love to hear about your experiences and how you've worked through tough situations in your relationships. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's create a conversation about forgiveness, growth, and the power of second chances. If you're going through something similar, remember, it's never too late to start the journey of healing, no matter how long it's been or how broken things may feel. And if you found your way back to someone after a long period of silence, your story can inspire others who are struggling. Don't forget to like this video if you found it meaningful, and make sure to subscribe for more stories of resilience, personal growth, and hope. We work hard to bring you content that can touch your heart and motivate you to keep pushing forward. So, if you want to see more videos like this, just hit that bell icon so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and remember, no matter how tough things get, it's always possible to rebuild, reconnect, and move forward. You just have to believe it's worth it.